Walk through any small American cemetery dating to the early 1800s and start counting the headstones. Then drive over to the local historical society and ask for the population records from the same era. In town after town across the country, the numbers do not match. The graves outnumber the people who were ever supposed to have lived there, sometimes by hundreds, sometimes by thousands. Local historians have explanations for these gaps. They blame bad record keeping, lost documents, or forgotten epidemics that supposedly wiped out unrecorded settlers. But when researchers started looking at this same anomaly across Pennsylvania, Ohio, upstate New York, the American South, and then in Russia, in France, in the British countryside, they found the exact same pattern. So who were these people? When did they die? And why does the official record act as if they never existed? This is the story of an anomaly mainstream history has refused to address for over a century. It starts with a single question that anyone can ask. Pick a small town in central Pennsylvania, somewhere in the Allegheny foothills. According to the 1860 census, the population was modest, a few thousand people at most. Now go to the oldest cemetery in that town and count the headstones dated before 1900. The number you get will not match what the census says was even possible. Researchers in the alternative history community have documented this pattern in town after town. Small graveyards in the rural Midwest with rows of weathered limestone markers from the 1850s standing in townships whose recorded populations could not have produced that many dead. Coastal cemeteries in New England with burial counts from the 1870s that exceed the regional Catholic membership for the entire decade. Churchyards in the rural South where unnamed graves stretch back into forests that were not officially settled until decades after the dates carved into the stones. These are not isolated cases. They form a pattern that crosses state lines, then national borders, then continents. Russian researchers have logged the same anomaly in Siberian villages. French investigators have found it in burial grounds outside Lyon and Marseille. British amateur historians have catalogued hundreds of English country cemeteries with the same problem. The graves are real. The bodies are real. The dates carved into the stones are real. The official population records are the part that does not seem to make sense. Defenders of the standard historical record offer a few explanations. The first is that census takers in the 1800s were sloppy and incomplete. They missed people. The real populations were much higher than documented. This is a reasonable critique, except it cannot account for the scale of the discrepancy. Census workers in the late 1800s were not missing 30 or 40% of a population. To explain some of these cemeteries, you would need to assume the census missed 2/3 of every town it surveyed. And then you would need to ask why those same missing people generated death certificates and burial records, but never appeared on a single tax roll, voting register, or church membership list. The second explanation is epidemics: cholera, yellow fever, the 1818 flu, tuberculosis, mass die-offs that depopulated regions before they were repopulated. The problem is that documented epidemics are well recorded. Newspapers covered them. Doctors wrote about them. Churches kept track of them. The mystery cemeteries do not align with any documented outbreak. The death dates on the headstones span decades, not weeks. The ages on the stones include children, the elderly, and middle-aged adults in equal numbers, which is not how epidemics behave. The third explanation is migration. People moved through these towns and died in transit. But migrants were buried where they came from when possible, and travel records from the period do not show that kind of mass movement through these specific locations. So we are left with the same question. The graves are there, the records say the people should not have been. Here is something the textbooks do mention but rarely connect to anything else. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported across the United States in what came to be called the orphan trains. They were loaded onto rail cars in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, and shipped west to be distributed among farmers and townspeople in the Midwest and Plain states. The official explanation is that these were the children of poor European immigrants who had died or could not care for them. tenement orphans from overcrowded eastern cities, but the numbers raise a question that historians do not like to answer directly. Where did 250,000 parentless children come from in such a short window of time? European immigration records during that period do not show a corresponding wave of adult deaths. The cities the orphans came from did not log mass burials of their parents. These children appeared as if from nowhere. They were given new names, new identities, and scattered across the country to families who often used them as agricultural labour. The records of their origins were thin to non-existent. Tartaria researchers have asked the obvious question: what if these children were not the orphans of European immigrants? What if they were the survivors of something else, something that emptied a generation of adults from the historical record? The orphan train phenomenon and the cemetery anomaly may not be unrelated. They may be two halves of the same story. A story about a population that existed, lived, died, and left behind only the graves and the children to prove it. If you find this kind of investigation interesting, hit subscribe. We dig into the questions mainstream history has set aside every week. Now let us look at what these populations actually built. Across the United States, Europe, and especially Russia, there are buildings whose first floors are buried. Walk through downtown Sacramento, California. Walk through Old Town Seattle. Walk through cities in Kansas, in Missouri, in upstate New York. Look at the brick buildings from the 1800s and count how many of them have their first floor windows below ground level, sealed off with stone or filled in with dirt. The standard explanation is regrading. Cities raised their streets to accommodate sewage systems, drainage, and traffic. This is verifiable in some cases. Seattle, for example, has documented its underground tour as evidence of intentional regrading. But the same explanation does not apply everywhere. Why are there sunken first floors in rural Russian villages that never had municipal regrading projects? Why are there churches in the American Midwest with their original ground floor doors now half buried in soil that no construction crew was ever paid to add? Why does this pattern appear on every continent that researchers have looked? The mud flood theory proposes that something happened sometime in the 1800s that buried the bottom levels of buildings across the world. Whether it was a literal flood, a series of geological events, or something stranger, the result was the same. A previous civilization left structures behind. Then the soil came up around them. Then a new generation arrived and built on top of what was buried. This theory is dismissed by professional historians. But the buried first floors are not theoretical. They are physical structures you can visit today. Photograph them. Measure them. They exist. The question is not whether the soil rose. The question is when and why and what was buried with it. Now consider what these populations are supposed to have built. In the 1800s, the official population of frontier Salt Lake City was a few thousand pioneers. The Salt Lake Temple, completed in 1893, took 40 years to construct. It is a granite structure with hand-cut stones, intricate engineering, and a level of craftsmanship that would be challenging today with modern equipment. This is one example among thousands. State capitals built in frontier territories with claimed populations in the low thousands. Cathedrals erected in supposedly impoverished post-war regions of the American South. Train stations the size of small cities in towns that never grew large enough to justify them. And then there are the star forts. Across the world, on every inhabited continent, there are massive earthen and stone fortifications shaped into perfect geometric stars. They appear in the American South, in the Caribbean, in Eastern Europe, in West Africa, in coastal India. Their construction is attributed to local powers in each region, but the design is identical worldwide. Same geometry, same engineering, same period. Mainstream historians explain this as the global spread of European military architecture. But the star forts in places like Madagascar and Sri Lanka were supposedly built by populations that had no documented contact with European fortification engineers at the time of construction. Tartaria researchers ask a simpler question. What if all of these structures were built by the same civilization? A civilization whose existence was later attributed to local populations after the fact. The cemeteries hold the bodies. The buildings hold the evidence of who they were. The most controversial piece of the Tartaria theory is what researchers call the Great Reset. The idea that sometime between 1800 and the early 1900s, history itself was rewritten. This is a difficult claim to evaluate. It is also not as outlandish as it first sounds. We know for documented fact that history is rewritten by every empire and religion that has ever existed. Conquerors burn the libraries of the conquered. Successors edit the records of the people they replaced. This has happened in every period of human history that we can verify. The question is whether something similar happened in the recent past on a scale we have been taught not to question. The evidence the theory points to is circumstantial but consistent. Sudden gaps in architectural records, buildings that appear in old engravings but vanish from photographs taken decades later, maps that show countries and cities that the next edition of the same atlas no longer shows, the country of Tartaria itself, which appeared on European maps for centuries before quietly disappearing in the 1800s. And the cemeteries. Always the cemeteries. The unaccounted for dead. If a civilization was erased, its graves would be the hardest evidence to remove. You can rewrite a textbook, you can demolish a building, you can edit a map, but you cannot dig up every body in every churchyard on every continent. The dead do not get edited. Standard academic history will tell you that the Tartaria theory is fringe nonsense. That the cemetery discrepancies are explainable. That the orphan trains were ordinary social welfare. That the mud flood is a misunderstanding of urban regrading. That the star forts are convergent evolution in military architecture. Maybe all of that is true. Maybe each individual anomaly has a mundane explanation that holds up under scrutiny. But notice what happens when you put them next to each other. Cemeteries with too many graves, a wave of orphans with no parents on the books, buildings buried up to their second floors, architecture beyond the capacity of the documented population, maps showing a country that vanished from the record. A massive demographic gap that nobody in the mainstream wants to examine as a single phenomenon. Each piece on its own can be explained away. The pattern is harder to dismiss. There are researchers right now walking cemeteries with notebooks, photographing buried first floors, counting headstones, comparing them to census records, mapping the inconsistencies. They are not academics, they are not funded, they are doing the work because somebody has to. If you live near an old cemetery dating to the 1800s, go count the graves yourself. Compare them to the population records of the era. See what you find. The answers are buried, but they are not gone. The dead are still there, waiting to be counted. The Tartaria theory may turn out to be wrong. The cemetery anomaly may have a boring explanation that someone simply has not bothered to publish. Yet. But the questions are real. The graves are real. And the historical record on this particular question has more holes than answers. If this is the kind of investigation you want to see more of, subscribe. We will keep digging. The next video looks at the buildings that appear in 19th century engravings and disappear from later photographs. What happened to them? And why is nobody asking?